Okay, well first the OECD is very pleased to participate in this AQR seminar. So my presentation is going to be about trends in productivity across regions in the OECD, as well as trends in knowledge economy performance among regions. And this research is motivated by a couple of different key issues that countries are facing. The first one is stagnant productivity growth at national level. OECD countries are struggling with how to boost productivity growth. They're calling this, in a sense, a productivity puzzle because they see that actually the top firms are continuing to innovate and improve their productivity, but they're leaving most of the other firms behind. And they call this the broken diffusion machine. The second sort of fact that countries are struggling with is that even though across countries we've seen convergence, meaning that GDP per capita between countries, the gap has been reduced. Actually, within countries, the gap has been growing generally. And we see this across regions, across cities, and across people. And so this is what's motivating the presentation. Okay, well first, as I said, we're looking at these issues of productivity. So the first thing that we find is that on average across OECD countries, there's actually an increasing divide across regions in terms of productivity. We see a sort of mirror to what we see at the firm level, which is that the top regions have had much higher productivity growth, and most of the other regions are falling a bit behind. And so we've actually seen an increase in the gap between these top regions and most other regions over the last couple of decades. We've also then tried to understand a bit more the dynamics associated with these regional productivity performance. So we've taken regions and we've divided them into 4 different categories. Those are sort of at the top, at the frontier. Those that have these dynamics that are actually trying to catch up to the frontier. Those that are about keeping pace, and those that are falling behind. And if you look at the regions that are falling behind, this has pretty strong social and economic and political implications. Now, if you look on average, they would have to quadruple their growth rate in order to catch up to the top between now and 2050. So these gaps are very important. Now those catching up, if we assumed current growth rates, could potentially catch up in 2050. We don't expect necessarily all regions to catch up. There are very many reasons why we have differences in performance across regions, but there are some serious consequences we need to take into account for policy with respect to these widening gaps. Now, we also see within countries that we have a range of different sort of typologies of performance. We have some countries where a lot of regions are catching up. And then we have some countries where a lot of regions are falling behind. On average across the OECD, about 1 in 4 people is living in these regions that are falling further behind in terms of their productivity performance. Another consideration to keep in mind is the sort of urban-rural issues. Now, often urban regions are at the frontier in terms of productivity for a number of reasons. We see, however, that in terms of catching up, a lot of the rural regions are actually performing very well there. And what is in particular to keep in mind is that rural regions that are closer to cities have actually shown relatively strong performance. Those rural regions that are much farther away from cities, unless they have natural resources, tend not to do quite as well. There are some other issues that are associated with this catching up that I think are important to highlight. One is that actually what is common, whether it's an urban or rural region, is that they have a higher share and a higher growth rate in terms of what we could call tradable sectors, those sectors of the economy that are exposed to competition. And so even though urban and rural regions might have different growth models, this is a common denominator that we need to take into account for policy. Now, some of the other classic indicators that you think about, like R&D and patents, etc., they don't come up quite as strong as a differentiating factor for those regions that are catching up. So it maybe raises some questions about how we think about these productivity trends and what is driving them. Okay, well, there are a few things we need to think about in terms of the range of policies. So one is that we need to get this place-based element, as we call it, as part of the national conversations about productivity, and to understand why place matters in this big productivity puzzle that countries are trying to solve. Another issue is that actually a lot of the reforms that are designed to boost productivity are perhaps more effective if we combine them with policies that think about place, and often these are considered regional development policies, urban development policies, or rural development policies. Another issue is how we think about these regional strategies for economic development. And often there is a sort of high-tech bias, and everyone wants to be sort of the superstar in biotech, nanotech, etc. And what we have seen in the data is that actually, even if productivity gaps have widened, there has been some closing in some of the gaps on a number of knowledge economy indicators, such as R&D or the share of tertiary educated workers. So it means that in our regional strategies, we need to go a bit beyond just thinking that science and technology will be the only answer, because clearly there are some other dynamics at play that are influencing this productivity performance. And in order to boost economic development in these regions, we need to think about this broader portfolio of policy instruments to boost productivity.